Buenas tardes.
Good afternoon. During this afternoon, we will talk about digital consumer protection and infant, how we can protect the childhood in this virtual media, and how protected is the digital consumer. Follow our social media, Twitter and Instagram, hashtag CRCCall, and in Facebook, Regulación de Comunicaciones. Digital conversation, sharing your context using hashtag Escuela Taller CRC 2020. Let's start this afternoon with this infancy, consumption, and content with Carolina Antipalma, responsible since 2010 of convergence of the child channel Paca Paca. Carolina de Paca is PhD from OLP, PPP.com, UFF, Brazil, studying communication in La Universidad de La Plata. The thesis is about the digital convergence in childhood and public. New youth in the Cultural Director of Education at Buenos Aires Province since 2009. The floor is yours. Hi, good morning, and thank you, Gladys, very much. Thank you to the CRC Colombia. So my talk is going to be, I'm responsible of the digital content at Paca Paca channel. It is a public TV for children, master in communication and education. And we are producing digital content in Paca Paca and thinking in the digital convergence, created different exploratory project, microsites, video game, interactive game, and some were complemented in the audiovisual screen. Others had the autonomy of the audiovisual screen canvas. But when we start with the transformation and the cultural transformation linked to the new technology, that's the digital technology. So we realize that with the same landscapes of the analog TV, Paca Paca, public TV, the different philosophies we were proposing in our channel with the analog TV wasn't the same, or maybe not as what we needed to think with the digital devices. So we field research, and we continue doing it with the infants from the cultural view standpoint, in the recognition, instancy, the field in the qualitative, and some deep analysis. So we started to analyze and to see that the culture linked to the digital technology was transforming in terms of the subjectivity process, the relationships of power and government, and the narrative, how to tell the world on how to tell from ourselves. So in the beginning, we started to produce these contents for more than 10 years, and then it was interrupted. Now we are retaking it, and in the channel we are approaching more and more the video game developers in Argentina, electronic artists, art, video game, all the developers to get closer to the field, understanding the new dynamics of the new cultures and how to tell stories for what, and what is the sense of the use of these video games linked to this audiovisual screen. So that was just as an introduction where it all started from, and I'm going to share one of our last research, the last one that we have here. And it starts with 2020 current research, but let's begin first with this. Okay, I'm gonna share a screen. Where we saw that with regards to that new digital technology, there was a reorganization of the different scripts in the organizations and relationship of force and power. But at the same time, the virtual spaces were to build the identity of the new generations. Building this identity and this relationship weren't spaces promoted as public spaces. They were offered by the market in the reality. So we started to see the historical context of the transformation and the video game, where it began. The transmedia, what is the historical context, the real virtuality. So we said, okay, these current deployments have to do with the transformation of the telecommunications spectrum. On the one hand, just thinking on this transformation, the different power engagements and forces diagram, thinking that technology not as an instrument but as a technicity. The studies will show that the technologies have one component embedded within the cultural reconfiguration that has access to all the fields of culture. So we wanted to understand how this sensitivity was transforming due to the new technologies and the non-linear technology in every device, virtual and digital. On the one hand, we saw that under this context, there is a new business model. That's very important to think in the new regulations for the new spectrum, and that has to do with the monetization of data or time, spare time. Every space of game that are all today in the infants are spaces that are using the game data, the energy of a child behind this virtual game, transforming into a mega data that is being sold. That business model linked to the new economy that has one profit extraction in the digital space and in the consumption, not as we thought at the beginning in the production. Production is automated now. Currently, in this historical period of time, there is profit also with the consumption. Therefore, the spare time monetization as a new business model was going through all of us, but also through all the children, and we will see how. Rethinking the idea to digitalize all the territories is not new, and it is accelerated with the pandemic that accelerated this digitalization, but that has been done since 20 years with something that was in Okinawa Summit by 20,000 with information, and in parallel Internet governance. Those are action plans by the G7, International Union of Telecom. International calls to connect the world to the Internet governance, to the global society of information, to connect the world, implemented by the Communication International Society, that the states digitalize every territory. So is everyone's digitalization implementing public policies of the use and implementation of the infrastructure, the equipment needed for the digitalization and every expression it enables, and also public policies of the legitimization of the use of the digital. The process has been generated since 20 years ago, and it begins like this way. It has these things associated to the global information, the Internet governance, and the plan to connect the world. And to connect the world, it means to digitalize all the territories. So what happens when there is a digitalization of that spectrum? We need to think this for the infants mainly, and for everything. In this digital world of metadata, there is an algorithm. I mean, one thing was when we had analogical communications, and then a different one is when the spectrum is digitalized, and it implies a business model to the market, because there is a digital dividend, compressing the data, digitalizing, compressing, giving more space to the spectrum, and there will be more options to transfer data. As we said at the beginning, a contemporaneous business model. On the one hand, you're going to have one, technology transforming the subjectivity models, the sensitivity, a new governance link to an contemporaneous economy model, automation in the production, in the consumption at work, more and more cognitive or intellectual consumption that is going to be transformed into a metadata for the large algorithmic combination in the digital spaces. What's key that we can see here is that the digital spaces, so far, the analogic spectrum that's digitalized is not ruled by the rule of law. In Argentina, we have a law to protect the personal data, protecting the physical individual, how you name what's human, what right is protecting to that is human, but data is not included within these regulatory frameworks. And that's the reason why, we have an organic entity linked to an IP generating metadata in the digital spaces won't be protected by the rule of law, and those metadata delivered by our body with these consoles. These virtual spaces, so far, we can call them as virtual spaces of exception. Gamben was mentioned them to that, but the ways to live in the digital spaces are of exception. So now we wonder, how is the relationship between the new economy, the digital culture, and the spare times? So our findings were, after doing the analysis on the pitch and the recognition, how the different pitches in the digital media cultures to the infants, and they called them this way. The common sense built through the screens, the games have to do with. The game couldn't be infinite, the cloud is infinite, so there is no pause for the games. Last year and before the last year, something new in the games was that there was no pause. And also they call to the consumption of different energies in these digitalization spaces, with the idea that the game is infinite in the digital spaces. So we'll see that later on in detail with some examples. I want to know if I can sum up Disney Infinity multiplayer, Disney community, and the name is Disney Infinity. So the idea of the infinity is always included within the digital spaces. The slogan is play out without limits. Play without limits. So it means to play without any limit. And that's what the script proposes in every contemporaneous game. There is no limits within every play time. The PlayStation policy is live in PlayStation 4. And the internet connectivity, because there is always a cloud connection, is key to understand that this business model will only work in an intensified manner when there is an internet connection. And that's another reason why the video games this year and the former year are play online multiplayer, because with that internet connection you can have an algorithm combination of data, and the model works like that. And what is the market proposal, and what can be the problem today? There is a body, an organic body of a child connected to this console that is driving energies from an avatar that is going to be moving within the virtual space. But behind there is the organic body and the avatar in the digital space. The organic is protected by the rule of law, but not the avatar. The organic body has their own limits of the human life, pain, death, tiredness, but not the avatar. Somehow the avatar can play all the time as possible. So the conflict comes when the organic body cannot respond to the demand of the avatar about the digital cultural screens exchange. What happened with those organic bodies that are not able to respond to the demand of the telecom and the screens through the video games and series and social media? Non-interruption dynamic is everywhere. So the market started to offer food that deliver energy. So this new food, Nesquik, La Pachorra. I have many examples here. And the art component is the medication like Concert, Frutali, different medications driving all the infants transformed by this incivity with these speeches at school or in the families and through the modernity. So the how to exchange these landscapes at game has to do with the cult of the body, optimizations, strength, flexibility, speed, efficiency, yield, good health, and the impact. And all this is installed as a common sense in all the mediatic culture pitches in the screens. And this is another thing that you can see in the games, the infinite cloud, and everything is possible in the web. Your browser is the open door to everything, the gate. The browser, for example, Google, you can have a gate for everything. You choose everything, Movistar, that's everywhere. The credit cards and supporting lives on the game, and that's a bio contemporaneous policy, and how the carers, thinking that that's the best for the children, they buy more and more lives when they die or when they're tired. So they are consuming lives during the game, so you need to recharge them. And there is no death. That's included in every game. There is no pain, so you kill without pain. And there are no limits. That's promoted a lot today. And to play to the infinite, proposed by the majority of the games today. Interpolation horizons. The kids are big and they can make decisions. The autonomy, the frozen autonomy are all of consumption. So the kids feel they're free, autonomous, and there is so much conflict when in the organic space they have conflicts with the carers or brothers or sisters, because the digital spaces is calling them to the value of freedom that has nothing to do with our democracy, the one that we know, with responsibilities. So that responsibility is within the digital space for the consumption. We see in this context that any mediation, those are not the same. There are peer mediation and all these platforms where the kids live playing and going to the games through these mediations, once again, are spaces proposed as public but are private. Besides having this peer mediation, and all this is connected to the cloud, there are also algorithmic mediation, non-human machines that are composing the online-offline subjectivity. So they are linked, so there is not a virtual subjectivity, neither a physical offline subjectivity. The subjectivity process is given within the articulation between online and offline. And I believe in that articulation process is where the politic contemporaneous process problem is. And it has to do when the body is struggling. With regards to the adults, we know since long time that the cultural industries normally kill the parents, and more, they don't estimate the education and they estimate the teachers, and also the parents are taken out of the culture of the digital consumption. In the same way, the same happens with the current video game and the consumption. They call the kids to a way of living that, although it has to do only with the digital spaces and proposed as autonomous, are without any adults. Many things that we can find in the screens, not even the carers or the teachers know what's going on inside these screens. This is the field work done jointly with those teachers, and we have future teachers that are being educating for the kindergarten and elementary school, so they work with us in different fields. So the first research is this one, and the next one would be kind of the last one where we are currently done during this year. Well, during this year, we did cultural consumption, appropriation and use of that consumption, with kids trying to hear what they can say and the sense why they are consuming. We don't care the pitch, the ruling, just the appropriation context, how each community of kids appropriates the different consumptions proposed by the markets. But what's the purpose behind that? We're just getting to the end of the year with this research, so I'm going to show you what they have consumed and more with this pandemic. A key thing that happened with the pandemic is that many were watching series and now they start to play more in these environments of video games, as I just said. The Among Us cartoons that are the identification that they have with all the kids and current ways of being in the world. The ones that they play the most is Roblox, a large game with many games inside. They can create the game, but at the same time they can play different games completely linked to the consumption relationship. They exchange objects, games, that sometimes engage coin in Roblox or credit cards. With the pandemic, they created Roblox COVID. Call of Duty 2020 launched during the pandemic, and I have here the proposal is the Infinite Modern War, Infinite again, within the virtual world, where they say that every infinite is possible, and the duty, Call of Duty, that's something to think about. Free Fire and Fortnite has the same script. For Fire points to this population with less resources, Fortnite with more resources. Free Fire is done for mobiles, Fortnite for Play 4. The script is the same, online games proposing this field battle, and the last who survives is the winner. They can build teams, but sometimes the builds play against, so just one will be the winner. Free Fight and Fortnite has the same script. But what's interesting in Free Fire and Fortnite is that the kids, through the avatars, fall to a map, and the view here, we have a case with these flying backpacks, deploying some parachutes. The vertical view is interesting to think the contemporaneous transformation of subjectivity and narrative. It's not human as we were thinking, subjective, first person or third person. No, it's one that could be from a drone. The vertical view implies different power relationships. Minecraft played a lot. this is older, but 1 year ago, an update was launched. And one of the reasons why this business works is that permanently they update and they want to continue with the news. So Mindplot is proposing there are never two worlds that are equal, because they have open algorithms, so an open world, a sandbox, and Minecraft is proposed as an open world where you can choose where you're gonna go. The reality is that contemporaneous issues have not much to do with the content or the access to the information, but with the forms that are allowing the movement and the options within the digitalized spaces. It is not just about content, it is about forms, and that's today the issue. This open world can be installed with some common sense, but also they have some soft and hard conditions that are not allowing this any type of freedom. The freedom is in terms of what the programmers will determine in terms of hard and soft. Minecraft launched within all the game options one game of survival. The game rules are set by us, and we can build that freely. Freedom, again, an idea proposed for these infants. Limited resources for every block. That conception that they can have a limited resources for these video games. Among Us is another contemporaneous game launched recently, and it is a group of aliens, or we don't know what type of characters there are, and they need to see where there is a fraud, or they need to send them. So it is connected to the cloud also. Just Dance. This is very interesting because the slogan is the game that you will never abandon, calling to the infinite world. And the spectacle that's not new, to turn our room into the best dancing venue, and they just need their hand and nothing else. The relationship between the Internet of the Things, a contemporaneous technology from smart city, but embedding more the connections to the Internet with all the algorithm governance and the physical territorial spaces. Just Dance has a dancing model. You can see up a human figure, and below the icons of the movements that are teaching you how you need to move. When Just Dance, would you do it perfectly fine, copying the movement of the model in the screen. And when you mimic that, and it comes the icons that are below, that are reducing or comprising the movement options to these icons that are telling you what to do. What matters here is that if this game calls to the kids' movement, the only thing that it enables is to copy, to mimic. Just Done for PS4 with different social events to share the mimics of these dance models. So all these digital consumptions of this year are all in the communities, platform interfaces, digitalized, not in the analogic spectrum, data linked to the credit cards. They have advertising, and that's not regulated so far by the rule of law. Steam, Twitch, YouTube, every gaming platform. They are also in Discord, used a lot by the teachers, at least here, because they have a lot of leverages for the community, but these are some visibility spaces, narrative creation given by the market. YouTubers and YouTube as an interface space displacing the national TV. Many of these kids are watching bigger gamers. The reference are older peers. And you have here the YouTubers maps around the world. So this is a global phenomenon. This is not local, but it's very interesting to think on the initial internet governance, the development, and the international call that has to do to try to find a global citizenship. And at one state, citizenship, YouTubers gamers and YouTubers kids. Okay, you can see the different consoles. So the console should be seen because that's what is allowing the exchange to be online and offline. On one hand, the body engaged to an IP, and on the other side, an avatar that has their own life in the digital space, engaged to the power of that organic body who is moving, winning, losing, sad, dancing in the digital space. And our network, TikTok, what happened with COVID, implemented different topics linked to this pandemic. And you can see here just dance or the calling the kids and the new infants to copy dancing models that are short. Again, cultural transformation, the speed, short narratives. But they are inviting just to copy and mimic these dances done by these celebrities, the TikTokers. Thank you very much. So we will have one Q&A session, how to mediate in the middle of the COVID-19 crisis to include the children of less age to the digital world, and more with under the current circumstances is the only path to study and socialize. And if we add to that their parents are busy in the same conditions performing their work, the consumption is without any supervision. Well, the digital spaces yet are not regulated in the same way as the physical territories, organic bodies, the individuals in the rule of law. So it is urgent that the national states and the control entities and regulators will regulate the digitization of that spectrum that is current, mainly in some countries. There were analogic, but they're going to be more and more digital. So therefore, those digital spaces need to be regulated because there are business model extracting data, consuming the energies of infants and also everyone, but mainly infants. With regards to the adults, it's key that the adults understands what's going on inside the screens to take some trainings, workshop, because it is worse and worse the condition of the adults now, because this is happening without any adult mediation, and that's something different when they have the mediation. So if the carers are aware of what's going on, they need to find their own solutions, at least collective solutions, to mediate in these environments. On the other hand, the state is the only thing that they can regulate in the radioelectric space, but there is something also there that many times the algorithmic combination with the internet connection are not going, those that are going to the national server where the consumption is being done. Sometimes they're out of the state. So we need to think the new global rights, or the digital global spaces and rights. With regards to diversity and identity, what are the main challenges the online world has to protect boys, girls, and teenagers? The main challenge about the identity, that's the algorithm government. Algorithm government will show us in the digital spaces what we want, the segmentation done by the data selling, data mining. That's to do the segmentation, and they are going to send you more and more what you want to see. With regards to the identity and the identity building and the policy and the difference, and to be able to have a competitive dialogue with the competition and whoever, that is going to disappear with this algorithmic governance. So it is very important that the identity can be not just framed under the predetermined indication of soft and hard, enabling us the digital space. So there is a form that needs to be understood, and it's more important that than the content or access to some information and so on as these audiovisual forms. The algorithmic government is intensifying, make it more acute the stereotype and non-diversity of these representations. But okay, it has nothing to do with what was going on. And this is a different way of distributing images and information. And it has to do with this algorithmic government. And we need to think the narratives and the needs. The international entities allocated to the infants have a lot of policies and a lot of material to disclose that can be found in order to understand each of these contemporaneous conflicts. More linked to the grooming, sexuality, that are also very complicated and topics for the infants, but there is very few about the business model going across the infants also. The reality is that we need to think about this. We don't have too much. We don't know much either. There are very small groups that really know what's going on with this situation. And from the society, it's important to think with the programmation, hard, and the technique part. So when you see that the conflicts are also political, that have to do with the programming and the hard, as I said before, and the forms, possible forms of the living and playing and the movements and so on. So we need to articulate with the programmers, people that are working with electronic art, trying to see what are the expression potentials, enable them. As in any technology, there are important and new technologies to see the real problems in the control and governance and rights suppression, trying to think what will exactly be the new rights that need to be protected. There is a right to the open spectrum. It's a manifest that you can find everywhere, and it is a movement of free software and free hardware, and that's something very important for everyone, so we don't need to be embedded in this plot. But the open spectrum is proposing that every state will have part of the spectrum allocated to the citizens that won't be under control or merchandise in terms of data and so on. But there is not much available, so we need to do it. Remember to follow our social media, Twitter and Instagram, CRCCO, and in Facebook as Comisión de Regulación de Comunicaciones. So participate in our conversation, sharing your content about this event with hashtag Escuela Taller CRC 2020. Now we will continue with the lecture Protecting the Digital Consumer by Christian Tugum, founder of Compolicy, expert in consumer policy. Christian is consulting the German government, the European Commission in terms of consumption, member of the Association for the Self-Regulation of the Technology of Information. He is also spokesperson for the consumer platform in the Digitalization Center of Baviera, member of the Consumption Digitalization Network of Protection to the Consumer in Germany. Until 2018 was professor of political science, international affairs and political affairs in the University of Applied Science in Berlin. Mr. Tobun, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much, everybody, for inviting me to this conference, and in particular, thank you to the CRC for inviting me to this conference. And if it weren't for COVID-19, it would have been a great, great pleasure to sit there in the workshop together with you and not only to give a video speech. Yeah, the issue that I was asked to present was on consumer protection and empowerment in the digital world. And as we all know, digitalization is profoundly changing our everyday lives as consumers. And digitalization has a wide range of positive effects for consumers. It potentially enables us all to access and process information more easily. Just think about all the consumer reviews that you can find on shopping portals, or that you get much better access to whatever people think how you can repair your car and get advice how to do it. Obviously, digitalization also increases choice and variety. So there are much more products available for you to shop around. And by means of transparency, it puts pressure on businesses, which can lead to lower prices and encourage innovation. For example, in Germany, we have a lot of price comparison portals in the energy sector or in the telecommunication sector. And by increasing this price transparency, obviously, it puts a lot of pressure on enterprises, which leads to the tendency to lower costs for consumers. And digitalization increases consumer convenience. If I can shop online 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, that's convenient. But there are also barriers and risks associated with digitalization from a consumer perspective. If we look at it globally, still 45% of the world's population are still offline. So they cannot benefit from digitalization because they do not have access to it. And those consumers that have access to the digital networks, they might be concerned about identity theft, fraud, loss of control of personal data, etc. Hence, there is a lack of consumer trust in many digital products and services. And evidence suggests that only if consumer concerns are taken into account will they trust the new products and services of the digital economy. So what I would like to do now in my presentation, on the one hand, I will tell you a little bit more about digitalization and consumer protection and environment, and why consumer protection and empowerment are important factors to make digitalization a success. And if we want to make or take into account consumer protection and empowerment, then it's important for you to understand what dimensions need to be taken into account in an effective consumer protection framework. So that will be the first, let's say, 15 minutes of my presentation. I was then also asked to talk a little bit more about e-commerce in the European Union, describe the landscape of e-commerce in the European Union, but also describe the key pillars of the consumer protection framework in e-commerce in the European Union. And that will be the second 50 minutes or so of my presentation. So hopefully at the end of the presentation, you will have got some ideas from a Western European perspective on digitalization and consumer protection and empowerment, and on e-commerce and how to protect and empower consumers. So let us start with chapter 1, digitalization and consumer protection and empowerment. First of all, I want to restate the point that a thriving and inclusive digitalization process necessitates consumer trust in digital markets. As I said at the beginning, digitalization provides a range of opportunities for consumer welfare, but at the same time, consumers face barriers and real and perceived risk in the digital world that undermine consumer trust and slow the digitalization process. And let us look at a global survey that was conducted by the Center for International Governance Innovation, and it was conducted in 25 countries in 2019. And it showed that due to privacy and security concerns and a lack of trust, 49% of respondents said that they have reduced the amount of personal information shared online. 26% limited the type of online applications they use, and 18% made fewer online purchases. So what this really shows is that if you want to have a successful digitalization process, you need to address these concerns. And hence, in 2016, the Internet Society concluded in its Global Internet Report, without trust, those online are less likely to entrust their personal information to the internet. And those who are not yet online will have reasons to stay offline. The internet economy will not grow as fast as it could, and the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals will be that much harder to achieve. So if we say that lack of consumer trust is really a problem, then we need to think about ways in which to enhance consumer trust. And if we want to do this, my second thesis is that you need to take into account the demand side of markets and not only focus on the supply side, but on this demand side. And it's interesting to understand that heads of governments have put the task of consumer protection and empowerment in the digital world on national, regional, and international agendas. So, for example, if you look at the United Nations guidelines for consumer protections, they call upon all UN member states to work towards enhancing confidence in electronic commerce by the continued development of transparent and effective consumer protection policies, ensuring a level of consumer protection that is not less than that afforded in other forms of commerce. And the World Bank in 2016, in its World Development Report, wrote and reminded us that first generation's policies for the information and communication technology sector aimed at universal access and affordability have proved successful for phone services. Next generation policies must also focus on demand-side issues of digital literacy, as well as privacy, cybersecurity, and internet governance, where global consensus has yet to emerge. And I think what the World Bank argued in 2016, so 4 years ago, is still very valid. So, in order to strengthen consumer trust in this digital world, we need to focus on the demand side of the markets and should not only focus on the supply side. But if we want to focus more on the demand side of markets, that means to protect and empower consumers, the question is, what does it concretely mean? And I think one very nice way to conceptualize consumer protection is by taking the UN guidelines for consumer protection as a policy framework. And in this policy framework, you will see that there are 8 key elements that the UN guidelines for consumer protections point out that you need to take into account for a complete and comprehensive consumer policy and protection regime. And I will now focus on all of these 8 dimensions in greater detail. So let us start. So the first thing, obviously, is that you need to think about access to internet and ICT. And that means that you need to provide high quality and affordable access to high-speed mobile cellular networks and fixed broadband networks, because without access, you cannot participate in the digital world. Of course, this access should be at affordable prices, and it should be of high consumer satisfaction. For example, in Germany, but also in the European Union, if you look at different sectors in the economy and look at where consumers really have a great number of complaints, it is particularly the field of telecommunication services. Here people say, for example, when it comes to broadband connection, that the marketed speeds of broadband connection is often much lower than advertised, or that the stability isn't there, or that if you paid something and you wanted to cancel a contract, that you weren't allowed of this contract, and so on and so forth. So what we're seeing here is access to the internet is important. Quality of this access is important. Price of this access is very important. And obviously, well-responding telecommunication operators that respond to consumer complaints. So the first dimension of a comprehensive consumer protection framework is to ensure that people have access to the internet and ICT. Secondly, and closely related with the access issue, is that we need to protect the economic interests of consumers. And that means, I think many of you are economists, that we need to ensure that markets are competitive, because then you have competition in markets, or if you have a very strong dominant player in your market, then you need to make sure that it is regulated properly. I guess that's one of the core businesses that you're doing in the Communications Regulatory Commission and in the authorities. So what we want to ensure is that we have either competitive markets, or that we do not have a misuse of the dominant power position of dominant actors in the market. That refers to both the telecom operators, but also if you think about major digital service providers such as Google, Apple, Amazon, and so on and so forth, and the legal disputes that we will have from the competition point of view, for example, in Europe, where we have cartel fines or misuse of market dominance fines against market players such as Google in the billion euro regions, there you can see that we really need to ensure that we do not have some actors that dominate the market to the detriment of other smaller actors. Closely linked to this point, obviously, mergers and acquisitions should not result in a lack of competition. And to ensure that new actors can enter the market, we need to ensure that there is sufficient interoperability of products and services so that new entrants really have a chance to enter a new market and to come into play. And new phenomena that we are seeing throughout the world is that obviously these players are collecting more and more data. And so you have more personalized advertising. And to some extent, there's some indication that you have price discrimination and a personalization of prices. And here many consumer advocates are very skeptical whether we want to allow this, so that if I shop online, I might get a different price for the same product as you, just because, for example, I'm using a specific kind of computer and you might be using a different computer, or whatever shopping history I might have in comparison to what you have. So this is something that, in my view, goes against the economic interest of consumers. So here, regulators need to be very aware that the new technologies do not undermine the economic interest of consumers. Third dimension is a very old and traditional element when it comes to consumer protection. It's about product safety and liability. So consumers should trust that products and services sold on the market are not hazardous to their health and safety. And when we think about digital products, obviously what we do not want to see is that mobile phones, for example, start to burn and create a problem or a danger to consumers. Or if you think about smart locks, where you can use the mobile phone to open and close your doors, they shouldn't be able to be hacked so that theft can enter your room. Or if you think about smart doors that can be connected via Wi-Fi, what you don't want to see is that some foreigners will talk to your children by exploiting this tool. So what we need to ensure is that we have adequate safety and liability laws when it comes to all these digital products, and that we need to have regulatory authorities that enforce these laws effectively. Third dimension. Fourth, it's about privacy and data security. Many people will argue that the new digital age is really the age of the data economy, and this data economy companies generate huge amounts of personal data. So what we need to ensure is that this personal data is not collected and used and monetized in ways in which it is counterproductive to consumers. As you might know, in Europe, we have 2 years ago set in place the General Data Protection Regulation. And in my view, it is a good example of how it ensures that personal data is not used to the detriment of consumers. And the other coin of the same medal is that while you need to have a privacy regulations, you obviously also need to have data security regulation to ensure that, for example, digital companies and producers of smart devices, they really make sure that their products cannot be hacked, that their passwords are not 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, but that they use better passwords, that their ICT products can be updated with security patches if there should be new security threats. So what we then need to ensure is that in this digital world, privacy and data security is guaranteed. That means that we need to have good laws that ensure that people can trust that privacy and security are guaranteed. And again, we need to have regulatory authorities that enforce these laws effectively. Fifth element is about information and transparency. I said at the beginning that the internet is really wonderful because it provides consumers with so many opportunities to know more about the products that they want to purchase, about the companies that are selling these products, about features of the products, and so on and so forth. But what we also see is that in the internet, obviously, consumers are overwhelmed, sometimes with even too much information. So some regulatory authorities would already say that consumers are already kind of blinded by all this information. Just think about the privacy policies, and if you print them out, they might be 30 pages long. So who reads this information? So what we need to ensure is that consumers have access to relevant, reliable, comparable data about products, services, terms and conditions, and other vital features of a transaction to make informed choices. But we need to ensure that it's not just, long pages of information that no consumers reads, but that is presented in ways that consumers can really build upon to make an informed choice. So information and transparency is the fifth element of this comprehensive framework for consumer protection and empowerment. Second element is education and awareness. Obviously, in this complex digital world, you need to have new skills to navigate as a consumer. So we need to make sure that kids and the elderly and all consumers know how they can protect themselves, how they can compare different products, why it is important that they look at security features and how they use the security features of ICT devices. So what we need to have, therefore, in each country is that we have consumer education, and we need to ensure that within this consumer education, digital competencies are taught. And that should be an integral part of the basic curriculum of the educational system. So consumer education, and within consumer education, digital competences should be part of the basic curriculum of the educational systems. And the second element is that consumers should have the ability and access to competent professional advice and assistance from independent consumer organizations. So really important that there exist consumer organizations that are adequately financed so that consumers can call them, go to them, search their websites for good independent consumer advice. Seventh, in markets, there will always be problems between traders, producers, and consumers. And if these problems should arise, consumers should have access to mechanisms to resolve disputes and obtain redress for economic harms. And such mechanisms should provide consumers with confidence that their claims are settled in a fair and effective manner. And that means two things. That means, on the one hand, companies should have complaint systems in place, and there should be ombudsmen that consumers could go to, or ombudsman position in regulatory authorities that consumers can turn to if they cannot solve the problem with the trader, with the producer, with the service provider. So we need to ensure that consumers have good access to dispute resolution and redress mechanisms. Now I come to my eighth, my final point, and that is a good system of governance and participation. As we all know, digitalization has ambivalent effects, positive and negatives, and it is fastly evolving. And that means that we need to constantly adjust the regulatory framework to steer digitalization in the right direction, be it in the realms of access, competition, privacy, data protection, education, and all the elements that I just referred to. So that means that we need to ensure that there exists an effective consumer policy protection regime. We need to ensure that the consumer protection agencies have the necessary human and financial resources to promote compliance and to obtain or facilitate redress for consumers in appropriate cases. So we need to have strong agencies that enforce the laws and assist consumers. And we need to ensure the freedom to form consumer organizations, and we need them to give the opportunity to present their views in decision-making processes affecting them. And also, maybe in Europe, at least, we have the system, at least in some member state countries, for example, in Germany, maybe even the government should support these consumer organizations so that they can really fulfill this role of giving independent advice to consumer organizations. I will show two concrete examples of this later on in my presentation on e-commerce. So, in conclusion, what I just want to say is, if we want to make digitalization a success, then it is really important that we not only focus on the supply side of market. Yes, it is important that you regulate the suppliers, But it's also important that you focus on the consumers, because only if consumers trust in these digital services will they use them. And in order to create this trust, you need to think about consumer protection and empowerment holistically and should focus on these 8 dimensions, as I just mentioned to. And in that sense, consumer protection and fostering economic progress isn't a contradiction, but it goes hand in hand. The more consumers benefit from these digital things, the greater the demand for these products, and the happier the businesses that do and produce good products vis-a-vis those companies that cheat and have bad products. Key insights of what I was just referring to are written down in the study Indicators of Consumer Protection and Empowerment in the Digital World. This study was commissioned by the German Federation of Consumer Organizations in the context of the G20 summit that was hosted by the German government in 2017. It was supported by Consumers International and had input from a consumer representative study conducted in 6 countries. And we took on board the views of worldwide Consumers International member organizations. So if something of what I just said was of interest to you and you want to investigate it further, then just have a look in this study. So that was the first part. Now I want to focus on the second part, and that was understanding key consumer issues in e-commerce in the European Union. So let me start to describe a little bit the e-commerce market situation in the EU. And what we can say is that e-commerce is thriving also in the European Union, not only in other world regions, but also in the European Union. But as you know, in the European Union, we have 27 member states. There are strong disparities between the e-commerce in the different member states. According to EU statistics in 2017-18, about 60% of consumers in the EU made purchases online, compared to 30% 10 years earlier. But the proportion of consumers buying online is very different across the EU member states, with high values above 75% in Denmark, the Netherlands, Sweden, or Germany. That is the one extreme, to around 20% in Bulgaria or Romania. In general, EU consumers have quite high confidence in buying online, 72%. The most popular goods in online purchases are clothes, sports and travel, and holiday and accommodation. So that is consumer behavior. If I now look at the company level, in 2017, approximately 20% of all companies with at least 10 employees were selling online. So e-commerce is thriving, but there are disparities across the EU member states. What are the reasons for European consumers for or against shopping online? The reasons for shopping online, it is, as I said at the beginning, cheaper products, time savings by buying online rather than standing in queues to wait to shop offline. You can simply do it from your laptop or your smartphone. Possibility to order at any time of the day and also on weekends. It is easier to compare prices and products. You might have more choices than just at your local shop outside your door. And yeah, what are the reasons against shopping online? Reasons against shopping online is, on the one hand, some people prefer to go to shops and to see the products. They like the store owner, to talk to him or her, to see the products, to hold it in their hands, to check it out, to get advice from the seller, and so on and so forth. So that is one reason. A second concern against shopping online is that personal information or payment information could be misused, or consumers might have issues with, what should I do if I have a problem with a product? If I buy it offline, then I can directly go to the trader and ask him for support. But what if I buy something online? Then who should I direct my concerns and my grievances to? Or lack of trust in the safety of products sold online. Also, in the European Union, the market authorities conduct regular so-called sweeps. Sweeps are enforcement activities where they check for the appliance with European consumer law. And what they found when they made such check for airline tickets, mobile phone content, electronic goods, tickets for cultural and sporting events, consumer credit, digital content, products, and travel booking, they often found misleading indication of prices, for example, additional charges for taxes, the booking fee, or credit card, a lack of information on availability, irregularities related to contract terms, for example, the trader's liability in case a download damages the equipment of the consumer, or incomplete contact information, for example, on contact details. So while e-commerce in the European Union is thriving, there are these kind of challenges. And one should add to this that at times of the COVID-19 crisis, there were also a lot of criticism that healing products were sold that could protect you against COVID-19 and so on and so forth. So there was a lot of enforcement activities against kind of this misuse of marketing practices in light of the COVID-19 pandemic. So if we say that consumer protection, that e-commerce is really important for consumers, then we need to, or can ask ourselves, what safeguards do we need to put in place to have a good consumer protection framework in e-commerce? And the one element that we should have is an adequate legal framework, a good enforcement system, self-regulation by businesses, and aware consumer behavior. So let us look into each of these 4 pillars. Obviously, what you need to have is a good legal framework. If you look at the European framework for this, the Consumer Rights Directive in particular, you will see that we have enshrined in law pre-contextual information. So information duties about the main characteristics of products need to be displayed, the identity of the trader, the total price, including taxes and delivery arrangements for payments, legal guarantees, duration of the contract. All this needs to be given to consumers upfront before a contract is closed. The other thing is price transparencies. In the European Union, a couple of years ago, we had the problem that, for example, airlines were also selling consumers an additional insurance package. And the tick box for this additional insurance package was already pre-ticked. So many consumers just stayed with it and bought maybe a cheap air transport ticket with a very expensive travel insurance. And now the Consumer Rights Directive then said there shouldn't be any pre-ticked boxes for extra services, for example, travel insurances. Also, there was a ban on excessive credit, debit card surcharges on purchases, and at least one payment option that does not create additional cost, so that the total price that is displayed can also, by many consumers, really be used, or the products can be bought at this price. Second, there are legal requirements for the contractual process. There needs to be a clear order button that really says, there is an obligation to pay if you click on this, so that there is no cheating, that consumers, the traders trick consumers into buying something, and consumers don't understand that they really signed a contract now. So there is an obligation for a clear order button with an obligation to pay. And there are legal requirements when it comes to data protection and security. Post-purchase, it is important that products are delivered within a period of maximum 30 days. Consumers have withdrawal period of 14 days, and the reimbursement should be within 14 days of receiving proof of goods being returned. Furthermore, there are other legal requirements such as the unfair commercial practices, regulation to guarantee against spamming, and data protection regulations when it comes to restriction to store, use, and transmit personal data to third parties. So this is the first pillar for good consumer protection in e-commerce. Second pillar is you obviously need to have a strong enforcement system. For the EU, enforcement is not an EU competence. It is within the member states. So in the EU, we don't have one supervisory authority, but we have, and we also do not have a pre-market approval or licensing system that you might have, for example, in countries such as China. So, but what you should have, obviously, is on the national level throughout the European Union, we have national competent authorities, and they then cooperate in these so-called sweeps, where they have market surveillance and enforcement activities. To the enforcement system, from my perspective, you also should count consumer and professional organizations. For example, in Germany, consumer and business association have special standing in law to enforce particularly unfair marketing practices and even injunctions. So these consumer organizations or these business organizations can, on behalf of their membership, go to court and say, hey, look, this company is violating a law, particularly unfair market practices, and even issue an injunction. And obviously, to enforce laws, consumers need to have good access to an alternative dispute resolution system, as I mentioned before in my first half of the presentation. Third element is that you should have self-regulation by businesses. And one key element in e-commerce was the establishment of so-called e-commerce labels. So the objective of e-commerce labels is that an online shop can demonstrate their compliance with law and voluntary standards on their shopping portal. So, for example, we have Trusted Shops or Datenschutz Cert GmbH or Eurolabel Deutschland or TÜV, and they testify that an e-commerce shop complies with laws and voluntary standards. And here you see an example. Otto is the second largest online trader in Germany, for example. And here below, where the arrow points to, you see they have this Eurolabel. And particularly in the beginning times of e-commerce, that was really important to generate trust of consumers, that they said, okay, there are third parties, independent third parties that check the compliance with laws and voluntary standards, and that raised consumer trust in these kinds of new electronic commerce. And fourth element, obviously, we need to have consumers that are aware of their rights and have a good understanding of what they need to look for. And in Germany, we have two very important types of organizations, and you find them in many European member states. The one is the Stiftung Warentest, which is a comparison test organization that was created in 1964 based on a parliament resolution. And its objective is to provide independent and objective advice to consumers by means of comparative testing. So, for example, this Stiftung Warentest tested different shopping apps, or tested online video stores, or online shops for clothes and shoes, or online payment systems, or online car insurances, and said, look, these shops are very good and these shops are poor. So consumers then could read, okay, there's this trusted third party, the Stiftung Warentest. They tested it in accordance with good validated standards and came to the following conclusions. That means that I should shop rather at this shop and not at the other. The other important consumer organizations is the Federation of German Consumer Organizations. It represents the interests of consumers in the political domain. It is involved in law enforcement, as I just mentioned in my third element, and it is involved with these Länder Verbraucherzentralen in consumer advice. So what important role it plays? It conducts market monitoring. So, for example, it identified at a certain time cost traps, or when it now comes to the COVID-19 problems, it identified, okay, there is a new problem in e-commerce, and it raises attention to authorities and to policymakers. It is involved in enforcement actions for injunctions and written warnings, and it gives consumer advice, for example, by providing brochures or information on the website about the rights of consumers to cancellation and reclaim, or be cautious, rip-offs, or on privacy issues. So the fourth element of this comprehensive set of things are strong consumers that are aware of their rights. And in order to have these strong consumers that are aware of their rights, you should have independent consumer organizations. Yeah, that brings me to the end. And what I just wanted to show you in the second part of the presentation was that e-commerce is a really strong pillar, and it's growing and growing and growing, the share in comparison to buying locally, in particular now with COVID-19. Obviously, the sales of e-commerce have risen again. And it is also here very important that consumers can trust that they shop online securely and safely, and the products that are delivered promise what they've been marketing for. But it is important that you also have a good consumer protection policy regime. And therefore, it is important to have good laws, enforcement, companies that are aware of also their responsibilities, and strong consumer organizations so that you have strong and aware consumers. So thank you very much for your attention. And as I said at the beginning, it would have been a great pleasure to be together with you at this conference and workshop. So then to also discuss and maybe also to respond to some of your questions. Thank you very much for your attention. And I wish you a very fruitful conference. And hopefully after such a long day, also a fruitful break. Thank you very much.
Gracias, señor Zhou.
Thank you, Mr. Thomas. So now we have a space to answer some of the questions. How the regulators can enhance the focus so there is a better balance between the consumers' rights protection and the innovation options linked to customer service?
As you present the question, there seems to be a contradiction between protecting consumers on the one hand and innovation on the other hand. And you can either have innovation or you can have consumer protection. But I think that this thinking is flawed. I think that you can only have innovation if markets work for consumers. Because as I try to explain in my presentation, if consumers can trust that these are good products, then we can ensure that those companies get the money from the consumers that really have the best products. So ensure that you have competitive markets, ensure that you have good safety requirements and so on and so forth, and ensure that consumers can really understand what is a good quality product and if it's worth the price or not. And then innovation and consumer protection go hand in hand. So there shouldn't be a contradiction.
Is there that the standard frameworks reflect the digital consumer needs?
Obviously, this question is really hard for me to answer when it comes to Colombia. So I don't want to make a judgment on the frameworks in Colombia. What I can just say from Europe or from Germany is that the digitalization, as I said, changes so many things so quickly. For example, a couple of years ago, we were talking about these cost traps and e-commerce and what we can do and should do about e-commerce. Suddenly, we are talking about artificial intelligence, augmented reality, and so on and so forth. Suddenly, the shift of discourse has changed. And obviously, policymakers, regulatory authorities, consumer organizations, they need to ensure that they're constantly moving with the technological developments. And hence, it is so important that we do not feel like, oh, great, we have now published this new law, and now we can go to sleep for 10 years or whatever. We have new institutions that will make sure that digital consumer protection is there. No, we constantly need to check out the market. What new technologies do we have? What new developments do we see? And then we need to constantly think about, okay, are the laws that we have, are the enforcement structures the right ones to address these new opportunities and challenges? Or can we use new technologies also to have better market monitoring, for example, or to enforce rights more effectively when it comes, for example, to legal tech tools? Yeah? How can we use technologies to better enforce the legal rights of consumers? So it's really difficult for me to respond to for Colombia, but what I just can say, digitalization is so fastly moving forward, so we constantly need to rethink about what we need to do and how we approach the challenges and opportunities that digitalization poses to us.
Thank you again. We appreciate your participation. Tomorrow, we will be waiting to you to continue with the 15th Regulatory International Workshop School. Have a nice day.